Welcome to Uggle's channel, thanks for watching today. Let's continue our series of going through all the Mega Man games on the Game Boy, and today we're going to focus on Mega Man Part 3. Now this game actually follows the format of Part 2 a little bit closer than it does Part 1, as far as like the boss layout, but I always like to start these videos off by looking at the box art for the game. Now as we look at the box art for the game, it's pretty cool looking, I'm not going to lie. You have this really awesome looking evil snake down at the bottom right, and this is obviously going to be from Snake Man stage, but there's nothing that looks anywhere near this awesome in the game. I mean, the closest we get is this, which is pretty far from that. You also have the little hoppers in the background from the Snake Man stage, which, I mean, they're pretty similar to that. You got Drill Man off to the side here, looking awesome. Drill Man's an amazing boss. And you got these two little flying creatures coming out. I don't know what they are, they're too small in the box art to really pick out. And just look at Dr. Wily's castle in the background. This is like one of the coolest designs for Dr. Wily's castle that I've ever seen. It looks like something out of Contra. I mean, this is just a great cover overall, all the way down to Mega Man's little cell phone holder here. I mean, that's gotta be what it is. When you start the game up itself, you're getting some of the best intro music that the Mega Man Game Boy series has seen so far. I mean, just listen to some of the song here. It kicks off the game incredibly strong, and it's sort of disappointing because none of the songs are going to be this good until like the second half of the game, because the first half of the game, the soundtrack's a little bit on the lackluster side. It's basically just like Mega Man 3 soundtrack, sort of watered down from the NES. But the second part of the game, phenomenal. But then we're with our first 4 robot bosses we get to choose from, and these are all from the Mega Man 3 NES game, and honestly they're some of the best ones from the NES game. Now when you load Snake Man up, you're going to notice first off, the background's different, and this is one of the biggest changes that you're going to have in the first half of the game here. This Snake Man stage is actually a pretty big departure from the NES. Yes, you have some of the same enemies, like the little snake heads that shoots little energy balls at you, or some of the jumping enemies, or little bombs that drop out, the little transparent parts. But as an overall, this stage actually mixes the formula up pretty well. But as you journey through this first stage, one thing you're going to notice that really separates us from the NES game is that you have a charge shot in this game. Now the charge shot doesn't come around until Mega Man 4 on the NES, but you have it on Mega Man 3 for the Game Boy. And it's amazing how much this shot actually makes a difference on the Mega Man 3 type levels, because it almost feels like you're overpowered sometimes, like you're just blasting through enemies that usually took a while to actually kill in Mega Man 3. And so it's sort of a welcome addition, but for players who want more of a challenge, it does sort of make it a little bit easier for you. Now when you do get to Snake Man, he plays exactly like he did on the NES, and I always felt he was one of the easier bosses on Mega Man 3. He was actually the first boss I ever beat on any Mega Man game as a kid, and so he always has a little special place in my heart, but he is pretty easy to beat. Now after you defeat him, you get a cool little cutscene here, and all the Mega Man games on the Game Boy have done pretty well with a cutscene after defeating the boss, and this is no exception. Good graphics, especially for the Game Boy, and just keeping up with the pace. Next up we have the Gemini Man stage, and forget what I said about the Snake Man stage being drastically different from the NES, because this stage is nearly identical to the NES game. You have all the same core enemies like the dragonflies and the penguins and the fish eggs with baby fish that pop out of the fish eggs, the giant penguins that shoot out smaller penguins at you. A great variety of enemies in the stage, by the way, but it is pretty much laid out the same way as the NES game. It's just like a shorter version of the NES stage. You don't get Proto Man in the stage, which I guess since it's a different story than the NES game, you know, there's no reason for Proto Man to be in here. But regardless, Proto Man's not in here, and that throws the dynamics of the stage off a little bit. But it is a shorter stage than NES, but it's still overall a pretty enjoyable stage. When you get to Gemini Man himself, it's actually pretty impressive that the Game Boy can handle, you know, splitting the boss off into 2 parts like this, but it handles with really no lag at all, no problem, no slowdowns, and it does it fantastically, and using Snake Man's weapon, Gemini Man is taken out in no problem. Next up we have the Shadow Man stage, and once again, this stage is nearly identical to the NES game, all the same core enemies, little lights on, lights off dynamics, stuff such as that, the parachute men coming down, very, very similar to it. Even the backgrounds are pretty much match it point for point on the NES, obviously minus the color, but the stage itself is way, way shorter than the NES version. Like I thought the Gemini Man stage cut out a lot, but this stage cuts out just an enormous amount of the stage, and you can have the stage beat in like just a couple of minutes, if that, and just way, way too short. And then when you get to Shadow Man, I'm not really sure why the game does this, but there's a massive slowdown in the Shadow Man fight, which makes the fight way, way easier for you, but it's just a super slowdown, and it's so confusing because there was no slowdown in any other part of the game so far, but this stage, really huge slowdown. But once again, it made the game easier for us. Following Shadow Man, we move into the final stage of the first 4 bosses, which is going to be Spark Man. And this stage is once again, just like the other 2 before it, is very similar to the NES game. It's odd that they really did something totally different for Snake Man, and then just the same thing for the bottom 3 here. But regardless, it's very similar, and you have all the same core enemies, like the little electric irons here, which that's what I think they look like anyway. The garbage dumps that fall down, trying to hit you that you have to blast away. The little plug energy guy that comes out the little sockets here, I guess, and he shoots out extra little sparks at you. Which is weird about him because, like in the NES game, when you kill him, another one comes back out. It's just an endless supply. But in the Game Boy, once you kill him, he's just gone. So it's way easier for the Game Boy. And speaking of something else that's way easier for the Game Boy in this level, are these little platforms that shoot you straight up into the spikes to kill you. In the NES, it's like one of my least favorite parts of the entire Mega Man 3 experience. But in the Game Boy, these lifts are so slow. And so you can just simply jump easily from one to the other or slide off. Have no problems at all. And so they made this part extraordinarily easy as well. I'm not really sure why, but at least in the first half of this game, they really tried to make the game easier compared to what the NES counterpart was. Then you get to Sparkman. This is probably the hardest of the first 4 bosses. And unless you actually have the Shadow Blade, he's pretty tough. I mean, he just sort of jumps around. He's just hard to get, angled just right for your Mega Buster. But the Shadow Blade actually goes forward and then comes back, and you can often hit him on the return of the Shadow Blade, which makes the fight way, way easier. But he is the hardest of the first 4 original bosses. After the first 4 bosses are taken care of, you get this awesome little cutscene here of Dr. Wily's castle in the background. And I was waiting on it because that platform is just primed for Mega Man to come down. And the game did not disappoint because here comes Mega Man. And you get this awesome looking cutscene that makes like a great background or a great picture to frame somewhere. But I love the way this scene looks. Now you move on into Dr. Wily's castle here, but only sort of because you only have like one level before you start fighting the other 4 robot bosses. And in this level, it's super short. I mean, like, we're talking like less than 30 seconds. You get to what is considered the end of it, and you fight against what's called Giant Susie. And I had no idea that's what it was called until I saw the credits roll across. But Giant Susie is like the hardest boss that you're going to encounter in the first half of the game. Like, it took me, no kidding, like 10 tries just to master the Giant Susie fight. And it's basically just this giant enemy that sort of squishes his way around the platform here, or around the area, and just incredibly hard to dodge. But just a crazy out-of-place enemy that I totally did not expect at this part of the game. But still, a good little challenge halfway through. Now when you do kill her, it's sort of odd because she drops a little energy pellet for you, and you have no need for that because the level is over itself. And so I'm not sure if the game was like at one point thinking of continuing on to have like a second half of the stage. It was eliminated. But it's just sort of odd to drop an energy pellet and then have no reason for it because the stage is over. Now in the second half of the game here, you can get 4 bosses from Mega Man 4, and this part of the game is significantly better than the first half of the game because these stages are, for the most part, mixed up more from the original Mega Man 4 stages. The enemies are for the most part the same, but the stages themselves are just way stronger. The music is way better than the Mega Man 3 ones because they actually seem to remix it a little bit more, put different tunes in there. But these 4 bosses, or these 4 stages, are great addition to the game. Now we start the second half of the game off with the Dustman stage, and this stage is super long. I'm talking like 2 or 3 times longer than any other stage in the first half of the game, and longer than any other stage that follows it in the game as well. It just sort of makes it feel a little bit unbalanced, but at the same time, it is one of the better stages in the game because it actually feels like it's a full Mega Man stage instead of a shortened version. And when you're playing through these Mega Man 4 stages, the charge shot actually feels like it's more designed for these parts of the game. Because there's certain enemies that have to be killed with the charge shot, and it just fits in way better with these levels. But also in the Dustman stages, you're going through it, this is also the stage that has the most annoying jumps in the entire game. Like, there are so many parts in this stage that are just like an instant death because you're trying to jump across the platform and an enemy flies out. Or you're trying to jump across the platform and the angle of the roof just hits your head and you fall straight down the little cavern. The jumps in this stage are extraordinarily hard, and that might be why the stage felt so long to me, just because it took me so long to actually get through the stage because there's so many places you could just instantly die. But at the same time, it also had some of the most enjoyable moments in the stage, like when you can sort of get this little guy stuck through here. Like, I love moments in the game like this where you can purposely get the guy to jump under the platform, then you jump down, he can't get out fast enough, and you can just blast away. I love moments like this in games. And the Dustman stage also had this cool little mini part where the top is coming down and try to crush you. And it took me a while to remember how to do this from the NES game, but this is one of the coolest parts in the entire game. Actually having to time your blast through here, when to slide, when to stand still. I just love little mini parts like this, little mini stages, because it just adds so much more complexity to a level inside the Mega Man game. It mixes the formula up a little bit. And that's really what this Dustman stage did so well. It just mixed the formula up way more than what the first half of this game did. Now when you get to Dustman himself, he's actually one of the more fun boss fights in the game. He's just simply knowing when to jump, when to slide under him, and then also when he's trying to suck you over there and you're having to slide away. it's not a hard fight, but it's just a really fun fight in the game. Next up is the Skullman stage, and I was really looking forward to this stage because on the NES game, this is one of my favorite stages in like almost all the Mega Man games, and so I was really excited for the Game Boy one, and it did not disappoint at all. It kept all the same core imagery from the NES game, with the skulls in the background, little rib cages sticking up as the spikes, all the same little skull bosses, has a little worm that makes his appearance in the Game Boy as well. I mean, it's just a great stage, and the music, oh man, the music in this stage is great as well. But this was one of the ones I was looking so much forward to, and like I said, the Game Boy one was just as good. Now the length of this stage is nowhere near as long as the Dustman stage, but it is longer than all the ones in the first half of the game, and it feels very close to what a Mega Man stage should be. And while I was going through this level, there's also one really annoying part here, like when you fall down this little hole here, which is the next part, it's immediately going to fall on top of this enemy unless you knew he was there ahead of time. And for my case, I didn't have enough health, and I just died immediately. And I can't help but remember, or think I remember, this was in the NES game too, and it always tripped me up. And so it's just sort of neat that they even kept the trolling aspects in the Skullman stage in nearly the same spots. When you get to Skullman himself, he's nowhere near as terrifying as you would hope he would be, but he's actually a pretty easy boss as well. Next up is the Dive Man stage, which is probably the most annoying of the stages in the second half of the game, just because it's so easy to die in so many spots. Because any of these underwater levels, they love to put these spikes all around that are just, you hit them and you instantly die. And so they're littered all throughout the level. But that's not specific for the Game Boy, that's in the regular Mega Man 4 on the NES as well, and so it was to be expected. But this stage has some of the coolest enemies in the game as well. You have the little robot stingrays that are coming through here. You have these little irons that look like Albert Einstein to me, or at least that's what I think. You also have the giant whales that come back and shoot the missiles out. There's just a lot of really good enemies in this stage. Now one thing that is missing is I remember in the NES version there's this little scene where you actually get to hop on like a little boat or something, or a little jet ski and soar across. And that's missing from this game, which is sort of disappointing, but overall the Dive Man stage is still a really good underwater stage. Now Dive Man himself I always really enjoyed too, because he always reminded me of a Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle toy I had growing up. I don't remember what his name was, I'll try to put a little picture here of it, but it always reminded me of that, and I always thought it was just so cool to actually fight that turtle toy in an actual video game. Once again, I know it's not the same, it's just what my childhood mind did, but I still think it's a really fun boss fight, and you just simply make sure to get hit by the missiles, and you sort of blast away at him when you're invincible. He hit by a missile again and continue on. Just make sure not to hit him. It's a pretty slow, pretty chill fight, and you'll have him defeated in no time. And the final stage, the second half of the game here, is going to be the Drill Man stage. And once again, this is a phenomenal stage. It actually made me realize like how much I actually really enjoy Mega Man 4 on the NES, because these 4 bosses here, these 4 stages, phenomenal. And the Drill Man stage, it looks amazing. The sound of it, once again, perfection for the Game Boy. The only thing that's missing here is I missed some of the colors that were in the Drill Man stage on the NES. Some of that's lost on the Game Boy, but it's still a really good looking stage. Now as you're going through this stage, one thing you're going to notice here is there's a lot of falling rocks, and I didn't actually know you could destroy the rocks until like the very end of the stage, which would have saved me a lot of lives as I was journeying through it here. But also this stage is just notorious for traps. Now I didn't really notice it so much throughout the game, but this stage here is like they took all the traps that were missing from the game and stuck it all in one stage. All these little extra items that you need hidden behind a trap. And some of those items are like super good to have. Like they have 2 E-tanks down here and they put it right above that, so they're going to try to kill you to get the E-tanks. And it's like the ultimate reward, but it's also the ultimate punishment if you fail in the experiment here. But this stage just has so many traps in it, and I actually like that trickery that they add into this part of the game. But it's also in this stage I start to realize this game sort of corrected the mistakes of the first 2 games. In both of those 2 games, health was extraordinarily hard to come by. Little energy pellets. This game is just like any other Mega Man game on the NES. You can get health pretty often, or energy pellets to fill you back up very often, and so it was a good little pleasant surprise. I'd say this game is probably the easiest of the 3 games on the Game Boy. It's still not super easy, but it actually just sort of made a few more little amenities to try to help you through it. Now when you get to Drill Man himself, it's once again one of the most fun bosses in the game. I actually have said it multiple times, so the bosses in this game are just overall quite a bit of fun. But he just sort of drills into the ground, he comes back up and you have to shoot him and know when to dodge. He shoots these little drills out at you, and he's just such a cool looking boss. All these little, drills on his head. I still remember growing up, my brother, he actually used to draw pictures of Drill Man, and I have no idea where those pictures are now, but I was always just so amazed like how good the drawing was. And it just goes to show like how much we truly did love the Mega Man series as kids. And then you finally move into the true Dr. Wily stages, and you get to fight a brand new boss here. And I don't really know his name. I'm going to call him Saw Man, because he turns into a little saw blade. And this is actually a really fun boss fight. I can't remember if he's in Mega Man 4 on the NES or not, But he's just a fun boss fight inside of this game, and he was a pleasant surprise. And then you move into really the only true Dr. Wily stage in the game here, and there's a nice little collection of all the 8 bosses, or all the 8 bosses stages throughout the game. It has little different elements scattered all about. I liked all of it except for the part where they did a Shadow Man stage where the lights went out, because they did that at a point where there were multiple spikes, and unless you timed it literally just perfect and knew exactly where the spikes were, you're guaranteed to die. And that's really annoying when you're trying to go through a stage and you're limited on lives or having to go all the way back to the beginning to just learn this one little technique. And it felt sort of unfair, especially being so late in the game. And then you get to the first stage of the Dr. Wily boss. And this here, he came down and first off, he just squished me like a Dark Souls boss to start off with. But then when I got in there, I realized it's actually a pretty easy boss to avoid. You just run from one side of the screen to the other side of the screen when he jumps up, and you'll really never get hit. But I couldn't figure out how to beat him for the life of me. I went through literally every single weapon that I had. I shot the Mega Buster at him. I shot every variation of the weapon I had, and nothing would hit him. And it finally dawned on me, you have to do a charge shot. And it took me a really long time to figure this out. And I guess it's sort of a neat little thing to make you think about it, but it did take me a really long time. Now, once you defeat him, Dr. Wily sort of pops out of the top, and then you have to use the brand new weapon you got from the Saw Man, of course, and you sort of shoots it up almost like a basketball on him. And it's such an annoying little game here, because it makes you think you're playing against like a super tall basketball player. Because every time you shoot it, it's just like you just slam back down in your face. It's just rejected every single time, and it takes forever to finally get enough saws to go through and hit Dr. Wily. Luckily, I stacked up on my E-tanks. I could actually work through it pretty easily, but it was an annoying little fight. But of course, after you defeat Dr. Wily, as he's traveling away, he crashes and then a little skull cloud comes out. But I love how there's like a little tear coming out of it as well. It's just a little comedic effect that they added in there. And then of course you have the credit scene here, and I like that they mixed it up a little bit from the first 2 games. It's not the same little galaxy scene. They actually changed the background color, and it's just a better looking credit scene as it's going through. And I also like after the credit scene is awesome little picture here. It looks like something out of like Mega Man Legends, and it almost makes me wonder if like some of that same art direction between those 2 games sort of overlapped a little bit. But I love the little background scene here of having with Mega Man. But then of course they couldn't resist the galaxy scene, so they threw it in here at the very end. I'm not sure what it is about the galaxy scenes, but they just really need them in the game. I'm anxious to see if they're in part 4 and part 5. I mean, at this point I'll be disappointed if they're not in those games. But overall, Mega Man 3 was a really fun game. One thing I really liked about it is there was never a stage where you had to just simply go through and fight all the robot bosses. This is one of the only Mega Man games I've ever played that there wasn't a stage in the Dr. Wily where you had to go through and fight all the robot bosses, and I've always dreaded those stages, and so I was actually sort of pleasantly surprised that this was not part of this game, and so I'm not sure why it was that way. I'm anxious to see once again if that comes back in part 4 and part 5. But as an overall, this game was a lot of fun. The first half to me was the weaker half of the game where it focused on the Mega Man 3 bosses from the NES, and the second half of the game where it focused on Mega Man 4 bosses was significantly stronger. They mixed the levels up a little bit more, the music was a little bit better in them, the pacing was a little bit better, the length of the levels was way better. It just felt like a better game as an overall, and the charge shot felt like it was designed for that half of the game. And the first half of the game just felt like a watered down version of the game or the NES game, and the second half of the game really felt like it sort of came into its own and achieved being basically its own game. These Mega Man games are sort of weird on the Game Boy because it's like they do want to be their own games, but they just can't hardly escape the shadow of the NES games, and so they're sort of torn between creating their own direction and just being like miniature versions of the NES game. I'm hoping as they continue on, they're going to sort of break more away from that mold, sort of like the very first one did, but we'll see how they continue. But if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Check my other videos listed up above. As always, go out there, find a great game to play. Just simply have a great rest of the day.